Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our series called Back to the Beginning. My name is Roger Toonstra, and I'll be teaching the Bible study brought to you from one of the adult Sunday school classes at Faith Baptist Church in Mattawan, Michigan. From time to time, it seems wise to go back to the book of Genesis and study some of the people of the Old Testament and the accounts of their personal experiences and interactions with the true God, the one who created all things. So open your Bible and follow along as you join us in this adventure. There are study notes for most of these lessons, so download those from the YouTube link and study along with us. We now join the class already in progress. Good morning and welcome to the next session of our study of the book of Genesis. You're going to notice something different this time. There's no crowd noise. The recording equipment on Sunday didn't work. And so I'm just sitting here on the couch and I've got some coffee and I'm going to just talk to however many of you are listening in. And we'll just continue our study. It probably won't take the normal 40 to 45 minutes because there won't be any interaction from any audience here today. So it's not my favorite thing to have to do things twice, but those things happen in life. So we are in Genesis chapter 3. We're studying the fall of man, the temptation from Satan through the serpent, in order to tempt Adam and Eve to follow his ideas rather than to listen to God. So I'm going to read for you the first 6 or 7 verses of Genesis 3. And if you're following along, if you have notes, there will be a link on the description for these videos that tells you where you can get the notes. And we are in the section, Genesis 3 section of part 2. So the scripture reads like this. Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which Yahweh God had made. And he said to the woman, Indeed has God said, You shall not eat from any tree of the garden. And the woman said to the serpent, From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat. But from the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God said, You shall not eat from it, and you shall not touch it, lest you die. And the serpent said to the woman, You surely will not die. For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Then the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was the delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. So she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. Someone in the class mentioned right off the top that notice that Adam was right there with her, and that's kind of important to the whole scenario, I think. So the first question in our little notebook there is, what is the purpose of the serpent's question in verse 1? And certainly he said, Indeed has God said, You shall not eat from any tree of the garden. And certainly a question posed like that is meant to put doubt into Eve's mind. And that was his intention, obviously. He wanted to ask her to be sure that she really understood what did God actually say, and is this what he said? And he even said it in a way, you should not eat from any tree of the garden. He made it sound like God was withholding the entire garden. All of the fruit trees in the garden was withholding all of that from her. So what was he saying? He was saying God said you shouldn't eat of any tree. And her response to him was, well, no, that's not exactly what God had said. Her answer was that he said they could eat of any of the trees of the garden, except from the one tree, from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden. God said, You shall not eat from it, and you shall not touch it. Now, of course, God didn't say anything about touching the tree. And I pondered whether, Eve wasn't with Adam when God gave Adam the instruction about not eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Eve was not there. So obviously, Adam would have had to tell Eve what the instructions were. And I just wonder, this isn't in the Bible, so I have no idea, but I just wonder whether Adam, just maybe like a parent does when they're talking to their children about staying away from something, maybe a parent will say, don't even get close to that thing. It's too dangerous. Maybe it's a fan or something like that, and you don't want the kid putting his fingers in it. So you just tell them, don't even play near it. Just stay all the way away from it. And maybe maybe Adam said something similar to Eve, and so maybe that's where she got the fact that she shouldn't touch it. Or maybe she just invented the idea herself that we should probably not even touch it. It's interesting that we know that Adam was there, but he went to the woman and asked her about it. And we don't know if Adam was there at the outset. It doesn't seem like this takes very long to work through. So maybe Adam came after the conversation was all in place. I'm not sure. But anyway, he did ask the woman and brought that question to her. And she said to him this, she said to the serpent in verse 3, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God said. It's interesting, we're talking about in the middle of the garden, the midst of the garden. In chapter 2, if you have a Bible where it's like right across the page, it tells us in chapter 2, verse 9, out of the ground Yahweh God caused to grow every tree that is desirable in appearance and good for food, and the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in the scripture, it tells us that the tree of life was in the midst of the garden. He also says that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was there, but he didn't specifically say that was in the middle of the garden. The way the sentence is worded, it could have been right in the middle. But obviously, Eve's focus was on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, even though the tree of life was also right there. And then the serpent answered and said to her in verse 4, the serpent said to the woman, you surely will not die. In the Hebrew language, they emphasize those things. Instead of saying surely like we do, they say, he said something like, dying you will not die. They always use the same word twice to emphasize that. My granddaughter mentioned the other day that when they're saying shalom in Hebrew to a Jew, one Jew to another, sometimes they'll say shalom, shalom, one right after the other, and that's a way of that they had of emphasizing it. So that's what Satan said to her here. You will not surely die. And he goes on to say, God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now you might ask yourself how much of that was a lie. Well, it's interesting if you look at the end of chapter 3, about, verse 22, Yahweh God said, this was after the fall, and he was getting ready to send them out of the garden. Yahweh God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, to know good and evil. And now lest he send forth his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore God sent him out. So God said basically to himself, to the members of the Trinity, behold, the man has become like one of us, to know good and evil. So when Satan said, you'll be like God, God knows that you'll be like God. God was in effect saying the same thing in chapter 3, verse 22. So in some way, Adam and Eve had become like God, knowing both good and evil. But obviously it was not a good thing to be that way, to have that kind of experience. In the notes that I handed out to the class, I have a question that asks about the temptation that Eve felt in verse 6. Look at what she says here, or what she saw. Then the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. So you have those three aspects of it. She saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. And that makes me think in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 16, the Apostle John writes about keeping oneself separate from the world, and he talks about what the world system, the way the world system tempts us. And he gives three things there. He says, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Those three things are what the world uses, the world system. Satan developed a world system out there that has these three characteristics to it. It attracts the lust of our eyes, it attracts the lust of our flesh, and it attracts the desire for pride, to boast against other people. And so you see that same thing here with Eve. She saw that the tree was good for food. That has to do with the lust of the flesh. And lust isn't always bad. You know, that we have certain desires, and when we see a good meal set before us, there's a desire there. Or we're in the grocery store and we see something that we really like to eat. It's not necessarily wrong, it's just something we like. And so we have this desire for that. Well, worldliness stretches that out to the sinful. You know, eating is not bad, but eating too much is bad. It's bad, it's a sin to be a glutton. And so we have to watch those desires. And so she saw that this fruit that she wasn't supposed to eat looked good for the sake of food. It was good for food. So that's the lust of the flesh. And then it was delight to the eyes. So that's the lust of the eyes. We see things with our eyes, and then our flesh might desire them. Satan uses that in sexual temptation. He uses it in all kinds of temptation. A lot of things on commercials are built on this. You know, if your hair will never be better than if you try this particular shampoo. And if you do, then everybody's going to see you have wonderful hair, and your life's going to be a lot better. And so there's these temptations out there. Again, not all of them are bad, but there's a system to it, and we need to be aware of that. And we talked a little bit in class about that Satan had tempted Jesus 3 times, and we weren't able to pinpoint exactly what went for what. But if, for example, Satan tempted Jesus to take this rock and turn it into bread so that he could eat, because he had been fasting for 40 days. So obviously the rock didn't look good for food, but Jesus had the power to turn the rock into bread, and he was hungry. So there could have been a lust for food, not lust of the eyes in that case, but a desire for food. And then he told Satan that man shall not live by bread alone, but by everything that proceeds from the mouth of God. And we weren't able to pinpoint all 3 temptations that Jesus had. When Satan offered him all the kingdoms of the world, I think that was a temptation to the pride. And I can't make all 3 of these fit those 3. But these are things we need to think about as we go through life and as we face different temptations from time to time. So what happened next? Verse 7, the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. So that was their attempt then to cover themselves, because they felt vulnerable and they knew that they had disobeyed. And then we get to verse 8, where they heard the sound. They didn't see him, but they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. The cool of the day was morning. The actual language says the breeze of the day, and that happened in the morning when the sun was starting to come up, and different heat forces, the cool places and the warm places, there started to be a breeze. So that was in the morning, the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh God in the midst of the trees of the garden. So they had to know that God could see them, but he was walking and came in the garden, and they could hear that. And my guess is that this was common, that God was in the practice of walking in the garden and meeting them and talking to them. God's always wanted to be with his people. And that's an important thing for you to realize. God wants to be with his people. And when sin first came into the world, he could have destroyed Adam and Eve on the spot and been done with the whole project. But he didn't. He was merciful, allowed them to live a certain number of years and bear children and so forth. And so God was merciful and kind to them. And he did the same thing at the time of the ark. God was ready to kill everybody and all the animals and everything there too. And Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And so 8 people were spared, and the living things were spared. And so God was merciful, and he wanted to be with them. So they heard him in the garden. And God called to the man, verse 9, Yahweh God called to the man and said to him, where are you? And that's an interesting question because obviously God would know where they were, right? God knows everything. So he obviously knew where they were. So I proposed a possibility here. One is he said it for their sake, so that they know he was out there looking for them. There's also a way of saying, where is something? If you have a particular place where you always hang your keys when you come in from outside, your car keys, and on one particular day you didn't do that, you laid them on your desk, they're there in plain sight, but you always go to the key rack to get your keys on your way out the door, so you go to the key rack and you see that your keys aren't there, and you say, where are my keys? Now you know that they're not like lost. You'll be able to find them, but they're not where they're supposed to be. And that's kind of aggravating when that happens, isn't it? You put things in a different place, and then you can't find them. So I think there's a possibility also here that that's what God's doing. They were supposed to be out there to meet him and talk to him, and he says, where are you? And then Adam answered, verse 10, Adam said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. And I find that interesting. Naked and afraid. You would expect it maybe to say naked and ashamed. I was naked and ashamed. But he doesn't use the word ashamed, he used the word afraid. And that's probably, some of the people in the class thought that was probably because Adam knew that he had sinned and had done something against the commandment of God, and therefore he was afraid of what the consequences would be. God had threatened death. The day you eat of it, you will surely die. And Adam and Eve didn't know what death was. Nothing had died. And so maybe they didn't even understand what that meant, but were afraid of what it meant. And so, in any case, or they were afraid of whatever punishment God might be bringing, or his anger. Maybe at some level, they loved God and didn't want to disappoint him in some way. So they were afraid, and so they hid. And God asks him, well, first of all, it's interesting. He was looking for Adam. He didn't go asking for Eve. He went for Adam. And so he says, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten the tree which I commanded you not to eat? And then right away the blame begins, right? The man said, the woman you gave me to be with me, she gave me from the tree and I ate. So the first thing he does, he accuses both the fact that there's a woman and the fact that God gave him the woman. It's almost like, if you wouldn't have given me this woman, I wouldn't have been caused to do this. So it's your fault and her fault. So God turns his attention in verse 13. He focuses his attention on the woman. And he says, what is this that you've done? And the woman said, oh, it wasn't me. The serpent deceived me and I ate. So she admits being deceived. And then she ate of the fruit. And so she admits that. And so Yahweh turns his attention to the serpent and he says, because you have done this, cursed are you more than any of the cattle and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. So the serpent is cursed and given the position to crawl around on the ground, get dust in his mouth all the days of his life. And he says, I will put enmity, I will make an enemy between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. In other words, between her offspring and the serpent's offspring. There would be an enmity. He shall bruise you on the head. In other words, the offspring of Eve is going to bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him. You shall bruise mankind, basically, on the heel. That's where snakes bite, isn't it? Very low on the body. But this, of course, is a reference also to the Christ coming. Christ is a descendant of Eve. And it's interesting, in this version I'm reading from here, it uses the same word. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. And in Hebrew, it is the same word. So whatever in the translation, whatever is used for the heel ought to be used for the head. The words should not be different. It's the same word. So he will bruise you on the head. Now, a head is actually, the real word means crushed. So a crush on the head is fatal. A crushing of some kind on the heel would not normally be. And we're not considering venom and all of that, but just an injury on the heel is not usually life-threatening, but a crushing of the head would be. So that's a prophecy, basically, that Jesus is going to crush Satan ultimately. And Satan, of course, crushed Jesus in a sense on the cross, but it wasn't, he did die physically, but of course it didn't do any major damage to the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity that Jesus was. So Satan made that attempt, but it didn't work. But what Christ did to Satan did work. And so that goal was achieved. And then he goes on to say, your desire, talking to the woman, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now at this point, I took the class to Genesis 4. So we're going to turn there a minute, and then we're going to talk about this. And that is going to be just about where we wrapped up. So let me talk about this a minute. In chapter 4, we have the situation with Cain and Abel. Cain was mad because Abel's sacrifice was accepted by God, and Cain's sacrifice was not. And so he's brooding over there, upset. In verse 6, Genesis 4:6, God comes to Cain and says to him, why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? In other words, why does your face look frustrated and sad? You're not smiling and uplifted. If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? In other words, if you make the right choice here, you're going to be doing a lot better. And if you do not do well, sin is lying at the door, and its desire is for you, but you shall rule over it. I want to focus on that last couple of lines. So sin, picture this, sin is lying at the door. Something is lying in wait outside the door. And its desire is for you. That can't be a good thing. But Cain should rule over it. Now what's interesting is that structure of those words in the original language. Sin's desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Those are the same, it's exactly the same construction as what you find here. I will put, he shall, wait. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he will rule over you. That's the same context, the same, it's one chapter apart. It's the same Hebrew construction. So we're trying to decide what that means. And it has to do with the idea that God made woman to be a helper for the man, to be a support for the man. If you've been following along, I compared it to a stepladder. You know, a stepladder, the ladder part of it that you climb on is inclined. Well, there's another side then that holds that up. So it's opposed, it's contrary to, but its purpose is to be a support and a help, the opposite side of the stepladder. So when the Bible says that a woman was made to be a suitable helper for the man, he's talking about something that's actually in opposition. And so in a marriage relationship, the woman is a support and help to her husband, but sometimes that comes in the form of opposition, in a good sense. The husband wants to get carried away with something, and the wife says, maybe we ought to think about this a little bit and not be so hasty. And the man can do that for the woman too. But the man was given by God to be the head of the home. So a man's sin can, as a head, can involve being bossy and a dictator. And a woman's sin then in the relationship can be that of pushing too hard on the man and working against his leadership in some way to try to undermine his leadership. That's when things go awry. And I think that's what it's talking about here. It says, your desire will be for your husband. In other words, he's saying to Eve, you're going to be trying sometimes to undermine him and to go against him. And he will rule over you. God's given man the rulership, but this is an unhealthy rulership because the woman is pushing against the man to be opposing what he's trying to do. And so in marriage, what we need to do is we need to find the right relationship where the woman is opposing in the right way to try to be of help and encouragement to the husband to keep him from going overboard in one direction or another, and to give advice and counsel and so forth, but not to undermine and to subvert his rule in the family, his leadership in the family. And so God, I think, is saying here to Eve, the problem is that your desire is going to be in this negative way for your husband. It's not saying you will desire him like to be a wonderful husband. It's a desire that's a negative desire, just like it was in the next chapter, talking about Cain and sin. And he will rule over you. Now, for some reason, I skipped the first part of that verse, so let me back up here. Sorry about that. To the woman, he said, the beginning of verse 16, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain and conception. And we talked a long time about this in class, and we don't need to spend that much time on it here. But when I was studying this, it sounds like, related to childbirth, the amount of pain that a woman goes through is part of this curse that God puts on Eve. And then he says, I will greatly multiply your pain and your conception. So I had never thought about this before, but my question was, does that mean we have more children? That's part of the curse. There's more conception. And I really don't think that's what it means, because having more children can be a blessing. But we need to remember a couple of things. First of all, the language could just put those two things together, just basically say, concerning conception and childbearing, there's going to be a lot of pain with this. And these two parts of it, the pain and the multiplying the conception, could just be a way of making that a stronger statement. So that's one interpretation, and that may be the correct one. The other interpretation is that before the fall, people would live forever, basically. There was no death in the scheme of things. And people lived a long time, at least, certainly. Some of the early people in the Old Testament lived 900 years. So there was no need to, quote unquote, for God to set up a system where a woman could have all of her children within between the ages of 18 and 40 or something, because children could be born when a woman was 60 or 150 or 180. So that whole time span was spread out. Once sin came into the world, there were rapidly shortening lifespans. Pretty soon it got down to be 70 years or so. And so the need would be, in order to build the population, he said, to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. So in order for there to be that replenishing, that all had to happen in a relatively short amount of time compared to what it would have been at the beginning. So maybe that's what it means. With the fall, you have sickness, you have miscarriages, you have all of those things going on. And so maybe that's what it means. There'll be more conception, because you know from your study of history, it doesn't happen as much here in our culture as it did in the past. But in the past, 150 years ago or more, there were a lot of children who were lost to miscarriages and early death in childhood from some plague or something. And so there was an increase because of that sin thing that entered the world. All right, so that's kind of where we're going with that. And I think that's what he's talking about here. The whole idea of bearing children is going to be more difficult. Plus, your husband is going to be ruling over you because you're going to be trying to undermine him. That's, I think, is the punishment that was given to Eve. Next time, we'll pick up with Adam, the curse on Adam and the ground that starts in verse 17. So that pretty much covers what we did Sunday. Sorry for the change. Hopefully this was easy enough to follow. And if you don't have the notes, you can find them in the description. You can find the link in the description, and you can download them from there. You would look up part 2 in that list of resources, and this lesson is in that section. Have a great week.